In the last two videos, we talked about demand and supply. In this video, we're going to put demand and supply together and talk about the notion of an equilibrium in a market. An equilibrium is said to exist if we get to a point where there's no tendency to change from that point. In the case of a market, that equilibrium point occurs when the demand curves and supply curves intersect. In this case, we see that at a price of $3, the quantity demanded equals the quantity supplied. What this means in practice is that consumers want to buy 60 units of the good at this price, producers want to sell 60 units of the good at this price, and all their expectations are realized. There's no reason for firms to raise prices or to lower prices. They're selling exactly what they wanted to, and consumers are buying exactly what they want to. If the price is above the equilibrium, though, we end up with a surplus. As this diagram illustrates, at a price of $4, there's approximately 81 units of the good that sellers would like to sell, but consumers are only buying about 43 units of the good. So in that case, what happens is that the sellers will have unsold inventory, and when sellers have this buildup of inventory, they generally end up lowering prices. So in general, whenever we find a price above the equilibrium, there's an incentive for firms to start lowering the price. And as that price falls, firms want to sell less of the good at a lower price, consumers are willing to buy more, and that surplus will disappear until we get back to the equilibrium price, which again is $3 in this case. On the other hand, if the price is set below the equilibrium, we end up with a shortage. In this case, if the price is set at $2, we have approximately 35 units that firms want to sell, but consumers would like to buy approximately 70 units of this good. So we end up with a shortage. Consumers are going to the store and finding there's not enough to satisfy their needs. And in general, when we see a shortage existing in a market, we tend to see firms raising prices. And as the prices go up, firms are willing to start offering more, and consumers will buy less, and the shortage will get smaller until eventually it disappears once the price rises all the way to that equilibrium price. So what we find is that if there's no restrictions on price movements, prices tend to converge in practice very rapidly to the equilibrium, and shortages or surpluses tend to disappear. The next thing we should talk about is how economists explain changes in prices. And basically, what we assume is that changes in demand and supply are the causes of changes in the prices of the goods that we buy. When demand increases, we see the equilibrium price going up and the equilibrium quantity rising as well. So whenever there's more demand for a good, we tend to see higher prices and more being offered for sale. On the other hand, if there's a decrease in demand, we tend to see lower prices combined with a reduction in equilibrium quantity, as depicted in this diagram. If supply rises, we see that the equilibrium price will fall while the equilibrium quantity tends to rise. When supply falls, though, we tend to see higher prices and less output. So those are the ways in which changing demand or supply will affect the equilibrium price or quantity. Try to think about some ways in which this might apply. The next thing we can talk about is what happens if demand and supply both change. There's a very simple strategy that you can use to determine this, and it generally is best if you don't try to draw both of those at once. If we want to find out how the equilibrium price and quantity will change if demand and supply both change, the best way to do this is to examine the effects of each change separately. First, look at the effect of what happens with demand or with supply, and then look at what happens as a result of the other shift. If the shifts in both demand and supply offer the same prediction for either price or quantity, then you can safely predict that that's the direction in which that variable will change. But if the effects of the shifts are in opposite directions, you can't predict what will happen to that variable. Probably the easiest way to see this is with an example. Suppose that buyers and sellers both expect higher prices in the future. In terms of demand, if consumers expect the price to go up, they'll want to buy more now, so current demand will increase, and as we've just noted, an increase in current demand will lead to higher prices and higher quantities. If sellers expect higher prices in the future, though, they're going to cut back on current supply because they'd rather sell the good later. And as supply falls, we know the current equilibrium price will go up and there'll be a reduction in the equilibrium quantity. Combining these things, we can predict what will happen to price and quantity. Actually, we can predict what will happen to price or quantity. If we just look at the effect on price, what we see is that the increase in demand will tend to increase the price. The reduction in supply will tend to increase the price. Since the changes in both demand and supply result in a higher predicted price, we can safely predict that the price will go up. On the other hand, when we look at the effect on quantity, we see that the effects are in opposite directions. The increase in demand increases quantity, the reduction in supply decreases quantity. So we cannot predict what will happen to the quantity in this case. So all we can say is that if buyers and sellers both expect higher prices, we'll get higher prices now. However, we can't tell whether change in quantity will be positive or negative. It depends on the relative magnitude of the changes in demand or supply. So if we want to examine all the things that might possibly affect the equilibrium price, we just have to go back to those determinants that we talked about before of demand and supply. And if we have more than one change occurring, look at the effects separately and then put them together to see what the net effect will be when we take both sets of changes into account.